In this video, we're going to do something a little bit different from the usual 3 patches videos. Today we're going to focus on the Orion series of modules and using them together to create what I call master patches. Not only are we going to try to fully take advantage of each of the Orion modules you see here, but we're going to try to weave them together into patches that can sustain themselves over a long course of performance. For example, if you're out playing a longer show. Patching and unpatching can be inconvenient in a live context, so having a patch that gives you the ultimate in flexibility is paramount. The Orion modules are particularly suited for this, so let's look at 3 patches that really take advantage of everything that these digital modules can accomplish. First, just one quick note on system design. For this demonstration, in addition to the Orion modules, I'm using a marble index for its excellent compositing functions. In many cases, you could also simply use the compositing section on the visual cortex. In the upper right is my modulation section, so I have a pendulum, a passage, a bridge, which is nice for taking the outputs from Escher Sketch and driving them to multiple destinations, and a staircase, which is just an excellent way to generate a number of modulation sources or extra image sources coming from a ramp. So let's jump right in. In this video, we're dealing with much more complex patches than in the usual 3 patches videos. So instead of showing you how to build the patch up from nothing, I'm going to start with a completed patch and then break it apart to show you what each module is doing individually. I went into patching this particular effect with several objectives in mind. First off, I wanted to create something of an organic system, meaning that the patch would evolve in natural and sometimes surprising ways. I find that this sort of approach gives the most flexibility for a patch you wish to use over the course of a long performance. Instead of things moving in a repetitive way, you're constantly getting new surprises. To achieve this, I set up a lot of intermodulation. The heart of this particular patch lies in the feedback capabilities of the memory palace. I'm using a still image of a geometric octagon shape and keying that with a separate shape being generated by the diver. Fortress is being used primarily as a colorizer. Everything is composited in the marble index, and then sent to the visual cortex primarily just for output purposes. To begin, let's look at what the diver is doing in this patch. I'm going to patch the output of the diver into the visual cortex so we can see it on its own. The diver is generating a fairly basic ramp shape. This is being modulated by 3 separate sources. On my wave voltage control input, I have a slow LFO coming from the pendulum. And in the H phase and V phase inputs, I have 2 other outputs from the staircase. This is being fed by a separate LFO on pendulum. This is perhaps a less known use of staircase, but by inputting an LFO into the source input, you can get 3 different speeds generated from the same base LFO. One of these I have going to control my memory palace, and the other 2 I'm using to drive the H phase and V phase inputs on my diver. So if I pull these down to 0, pull the wave down 2, you can see there's no movement. H phase gives me back and forth movement. This is coming from the divide by 2 output. The divide by 4 output is going to vertical. And as you can see, that's about half the speed of my horizontal movement. So this is a nice way to get some movement that's related, but not identical in the 2 different dimensions. So this H plus V output is going into ADC1 of the fortress. It's hard to see in the composite I have going on now, because I'm using it in a very subtle way. But if I take just the fortress output and turn that up, I'll turn the other channel down, you could see what's coming from the fortress. So what I like about this patch is that I can use this colorized effect in a very subtle way by using the opacity voltage control input, or with the flick of a knob, I can go to a much more colorful environment. Now my H minus V ramp from diver is going into the alpha input on my memory palace. My memory palace is set to warp for the path, an alpha key, and the ins are set to swap. This allows me to use the still image as the actual image content of the memory palace, and it lets me use the H-V ramp from Diver as the key. So, again, let's look at the H-V ramp. So you can see here this diamond kind of cascading across the screen, being modulated by the pendulum through the staircase. And basically wherever this image is white is where we're going to get a key on our memory palace. The color information, in this case is black and white, but we'll call it that nonetheless. The RGB information is being pulled from a still image, which is a ramp that I've loaded, which is an octagon-shaped ramp that I've loaded. While my diver is being modulated over here by an external source, I have my memory palace set to scroll. I also have it set to spin, and I have tile and reflect on. One of the nice things about this setup is that I have two asynchronous sources of movement. So the still image itself is moving one way, scrolling slowly. The diver is scrolling in a different direction. This leads to a more organic final effect, since we're not seeing the same scrolling repeated over and over. Rather, we're seeing the intersection of two asynchronous scrolling movements. In my opinion, this is a very beautiful effect and lends itself well to patches you want to exploit for a long period of time. If we were to use the memory palace without the external alpha and just use the still itself as a key, we get a much more predictable and repetitive result. So let's set that back. The outputs from the memory palace are being taken to multiple destinations. The RGB outputs are going directly into the memory palace. Let me turn this up so we can just see purely what that looks like. So this is just my plain output from the memory palace. I have the opacity voltage control on this channel coming from the Y output on memory palace. I'm using the bridge to multiply that Y output since I'm using it in 3 different places in my patch. While you can use stack cables, I have found them to be somewhat unreliable at times. So with the Y output from the memory palace going into the opacity voltage control, I can use this as a sort of soft key to make sure just the brightest parts of my memory palace image are being laid on top. I have the same exact signal going into the opacity voltage control from my Fortress. One of the reasons I'm doing that in this patch is because the Fortress is generating a very complex color image, but all I want really in this patch are the subtle fringes of that color information. If I turn the foreground layer all the way down, you can get another option. So in this version of this patch, I'm only using the Fortress as a colorizer. In ADC1, I have my H+V ramp from Diver, and in ADC2, I have another multiplication of the Y output from my memory palace. Let's take a look at what these look like on their own. So if I look just at ADC1, I'm seeing the output from Diver. ADC2, as I turn up, has that Y output from the memory palace. One thing I really like to do in my patches is have all the modules subtly interacting with each other. So by taking this Y output back into the Fortress, and taking the Diver, which is driving the alpha key in the memory palace, I start to get a very intricate and interrelated color world that matches the organic nature of this patch. Of course, I could also switch into the different program modes and start to get different, more complicated results. When I blend these back into the original, we start to get this kind of pixelated noise on the fringes. So another part of the idea behind this patch was to try to get a lot of different options for different variations without having to repatch the entire setup. So in this case, I can get something very pixel noisy. I can even start to increase my ADC modulation on the 3rd channel. And I can switch through different color palettes and start to get really different looks just by flicking a few buttons. Of course, another option I have is to flip through different stills on my memory palace. And each of these are going to give me very distinctive looks. Most of the stills I'm flipping through here are just different variations of gradient ramps. But here we can have more of a disco ball type effect. I'll switch this back to a sort of spiral. Right. Now, as I've been setting up and building this patch, I've been using the pendulum to drive most of the time-based modulation in this patch. I'm now going to switch that over to the Escher sketch, which will give me a little bit more control. I've got my smoothing turned up pretty high, and now, as I place my stylus on different portions of the touchpad, I can start to modulate these things by hand. If I hold down the record button, do a little recording, play it and loop it, I can now get a less regular type of modulation. And of course, I can adjust the speed and smoothing till I get something that I like. The controls on the memory palace also give me a lot of variation. So as I up the contrast, get something a lot more graphic. I can change the key position by modifying the center control. And of course, I can play with different options on diver as well. I can even start to introduce some different scrolling. I'll turn that off. I'm going to bring this playback speed way down. By playing with different options in the marble index, start to get a lot of different color combinations as well. And I can switch in some mix controls to get more dramatic color patterns. And there you go. One last thing I can try is I have an external input coming from an Andor 1 video player that's going into the RGB input on the memory palace. So if I switch my ins from swap over to ARGB, I can now use the external video in place of the still I was using before. This again just opens up another layer of possibility for this patch. The idea being that if I was in a performance situation, I could get a lot of flexibility without having to fumble around with a bunch of patch cords. A patch like this could easily sustain a 30-minute performance or more, with a little practice. Now we're going to look at a different patch using some of the same principles. At its core, this patch uses a pattern generated by the Fortress, which is then run into the memory palace for feedback effects. There's also a little bit of background color and modulation coming from the diver. The Escher sketch is at the heart of this patch, as a simple touch on the touchpad can open up totally new structures within the patch. You'll notice I have smoothing turned all the way up for very subtle, gradual transitions. I could also turn that down if I wanted something a little bit faster. One thing you'll notice with this and the previous patch, I'm partial to having a lot of negative space in my images. For me, ample black space makes the images feel like they exist in an infinite space, instead of strictly on the screen. So let's break down this patch and talk about how it works. Here I'm seeing the output from Fortress. This is the core for the imagery in this patch. Right now I'm looking at the DAC output. The Escher Sketch X and Y outputs are patched into the Oscillator 1 and Oscillator 2 frequency controls. This allows me to change the type of patterns. Any of the program modes will do in this case. Those RGB outputs then go to the input of the memory palace. My memory palace is set to warp, key to luma, and ins to ARGB. I'm also taking the DAC output from Fortress and putting that into staircase, which we'll look at a little bit later. Let's take a look just at the memory palace output. So here you can see that pattern from Fortress being processed by the memory palace. And I can sweep through the different portions of the image to get different keys. My rotation, X and Y controls are all zeroed out, so I'm getting a pretty accurate and symmetrical feedback effect. As I move around the pad, you'll notice this allows me to create different shapes. Because my rotation, X and Y are locked at 0, I'm going to get right angles no matter where I go on the Escher sketch. The Escher sketch X and Y outputs are also going to the zoom and aspect inputs on Memory Palace. I have my scaling set to graphics mode so that the zoom and aspect control scale in the X and Y dimensions. This gives me a very pleasant effect, allowing me to create these different rectilinear shapes with a simple touch of the pad. In this patch, I'm primarily using Diver to generate a background color. Again, I have Escher Sketch into the H and V phase inputs. Let's take a look at just what the Diver looks like on its own. So I've got my Diver and Mirror X and Y, and I have Scroll X and Y turned on as well. You'll notice when I touch on the Escher Sketch, I get a change of movement. And I'm taking that output from the Diver and putting it into a staircase. The 3 outputs from my staircase are going to an RGB channel on the marble index. So if we take a look at that, now you'll notice I'm also modulating the frequency of staircase with the DAC output of Fortress. And I'm also modulating the phase with the Y output from Memory Palace. So the final result in this case is a color background that has elements from the Diver, the Memory Palace, and the Fortress. For the opacity voltage control input on Marble Index, I'm using the H-V ramp from the Diver. When I turn it down, this gives me a very subtle background color effect. I'm also running into the mix controls, so I can change the color palette as I wish. So now when I tap the Escher sketch, while the Diver is contributing its own background color, it's also echoing some of the effects from the Memory Palace and the Fortress. I'm using the H ramp out from the Diver to drive the opacity voltage control on the Memory Palace output. So as I bring this up, we start to get our Memory Palace output. If I take that opacity control out, the background color is not as apparent. By bringing it up, so by using this ramp on the opacity voltage control, I'm getting areas where the background color is able to kind of slip through. Perhaps you could see it more clearly like this. So with my basic patch intact, I can start to play with different compositing options, such as switching to multiply or additive modes. I can adjust the opacity VC amounts. I can adjust the overall coloring of the background. There we go. I can switch into different modes of the Fortress, including ones that contain animation. I can adjust the speed of my Diver to get that background pattern a little bit different. And then I can play on my Escher sketch. Play with different palettes. Slow these down. And of course I can adjust any of the effects on the Memory Palace. I can change my keying. I could even scan through different keys. adjust the width. And I could even add an additional level of scrolling. In this case, I'm going to go in the Y dimension. Now, one thing I really like to do in patches like this is if I have the memory palace scrolling down, I'd like to have the diver scrolling up. I personally find that that leads to more complex and natural results. So again, here we have a patch that allows for a great deal of creativity and exploration. With just a few flips of switches, you can get a ton of different results without having to repatch or unpatch anything in the system. By making subtle changes along the way, this is another patch that would be great in the context of a longer form performance. This final patch revolves around the Memory Palace's paint mode. Once again, we're using the Escher sketch as a sort of macro controller. So by pushing different locations on the touchpad, we can drastically change the nature of the patch. Again, we are taking the X and Y outputs from Escher sketch, putting them into multiples, and then running them throughout our patch to different destinations. This one's a little bit more complex than the others, but let's break it down as best as we can. To begin, let's look at the function of the diver. Unplug that for 1 second so we can take a good look at diver on its own. So here you can see a very simple pattern. The diver is in wave visualization mode. The incoming wave I'm generating from a staircase. So I took the V ramp from my visual cortex, plugged it into the staircase. Let's show you really quickly just a little bit of what this looks like. So this is basically just generating horizontal bars. Those horizontal bars are coming into the diver and causing the basis of our visualization. Now you can see when I touch my XY touchpad, that diver is changing. And that's because I have the X and Y controls plugged into the frequency VC and the phase VC on my staircase. So by changing the incoming wave, it subsequently changes the pattern on diver. The diver output then goes into 2 channels of a passage, each being modulated by its own LFO. Those outputs go into the ADC1 and ADC2 outputs of Fortress. So let's quickly take a look at what that looks like. So there you see our diver outputs. So this is the output coming from Fortress. This in turn goes into Memory Palace. The alpha from Memory Palace is coming from yet another source. So I have an H plus V ramp, which is making a basic circle. That's also going into a channel of passage. And that is being modulated by the combination of 2 LFOs by using the C output on Pendulum. So similar to our other 2 patches, we have a lot of interrelated modulation. The 2 LFOs on Pendulum are directly affecting the 2 diver outputs that head over to the Fortress. At the same time, a combination of the 2 LFOs is changing the size of the alpha input into Memory Palace. In my opinion, these kinds of interrelated modulations really make a big difference in making a nice, cohesive, organic feeling patch. So the Memory Palace is set to paint mode, the key is set to alpha, and the ins are set to ARGB. So this is taking the color information from our diver and then using the circle ramp, which is modulating in size, as a sort of brush to paint into the buffer. The Y output from Memory Palace goes to the opacity voltage control over its own color output. That same output is going into channel A on the Marble Index, and that's just giving us some nice background texture. So you can see that's just the background. This is going into our color mix controls. Let's set that to Solar. So we can dial up a nice background color. And then we can bring in our buffer on top. The Escher sketch outputs are going to a variety of locations, including the X and Y position on Memory Palace. Since these are in scroll mode, what this is affecting is not the actual X and Y position, but the speed of the scroll. and the direction. So with a simple push on the Escher sketch, you could take your shapes and send them sailing off into different dimensions. Also on the memory palace, I have another LFO coming from the D output of pendulum into the hue input. A little bit of hue modulation, or a lot, is very helpful in paint mode. Another thing we could do is take the gate output from Escher Sketch and use that to trigger a clear command on the memory palace. That way, every time we make a solid push, it clears the buffer and gives us a clean slate. You'll also notice I have a voltage control into oscillator 1 of Fortress. This is coming from another output from the staircase. Oscillator 1 is not visible in any way right now because the program mode I'm in does not recognize it. If I switch to a different program mode, I could start to introduce some more complexity. And as I switch through different palettes, I'm going to begin to get a dramatically different effect in my patch. And of course, if you get tired of circles, you could switch the shape of your paintbrush to any of the other ramps. And of course, you could start playing with different blending modes on your marble index. You could also just use a visual cortex for this compositing, or just take the output straight from Memory Palace. So this is just one more example of how you can use the Orion modules together to create complex and organic results that lend themselves extremely well to long-form performances. We hope you found this video helpful, and as always, please leave any questions or ideas for future videos in the comments below. Thanks for watching.